something important for those listening to this who are the physical therapists, the exercise trainers, the massage therapists. When you understand even just the theory of this, you are able to better attune to and open up the door for your clients. Because if you don't, and I've seen a lot of people be dismissed, like, oh no, this is no way that this injury could be an emotional thing. Of course it can. Everything is connected. And so I think that's a part that I believe is starting to shift, and that's why we're having this conversation.
I'm Garrett Salpeter, and I believe that the most powerful and transformative way to help people recover from pain and injury, heal from trauma, and reach their highest levels of fitness and performance is to focus on the nervous system. In this podcast, we'll share knowledge from the frontiers of neuroscience and inspirational stories of how applying that knowledge has empowered people from all walks of life to heal, adapt, and grow. Welcome back, everybody, to the NeuFit Undercurrent podcast. I am joined today by Irene Lyon, who is a trauma therapist and teacher who has trained under some people that I really look up to and whose work I've read extensively, like Dr. Moshe Feldenkrais, Peter Levine, who is the author of Waking the Tiger. She's also trained under Kain, who I wasn't as familiar with, but founded a discipline called somatic practice. Irene is based in Vancouver and now reaches thousands of people via her online courses, through which she helps people transform trauma so they can heal and ultimately get back on track to living their best lives. Well, welcome, Irene.
Hey, Garrett. Thank you.
Yes, I'm so glad you're here. This is part of a few episodes where we're going to pivot onto a new topic here and talk about trauma, which is a fascinating topic and one that is so impactful for many reasons that we'll get into. But it, of course, it can have a huge effect on people's lives, and working on it can also have a hugely positive effect. So to help us lay down our foundational framework here so that we're all speaking the same language and kind of understand the basic concepts, I want to ask you a little bit about trauma, ask you to define what it is, also in the context of what we do at NeuFit, where we talk a lot about the nervous system and how a lot of the neurological responses to the trauma of injury are what cause muscle guarding and inhibition, are what slows down the healing process, how working on that can help accelerate the healing process, lead to better outcomes. So we're talking about, the types of, injuries and things like that. Some people make the distinction between, quote unquote, little t trauma and quote unquote, capital T trauma. And I know you don't love that distinction, but I'll be curious to hear from you, your, basic definition of trauma, and then also leading into why you don't like to necessarily distinguish between the capital T and little t versions of trauma.
For sure. So I would say, if I keep it really simple, trauma is anything that I'm going to go back, actually. I'm going to go back. When we think of a trauma, so most people, when they think of a trauma, they think of an accident, they think of war, they think of big abuses, being attacked, sexual assault, sexual abuse, childhood trauma, all the things that we all know for the most part are really not nice and bad and cause stress in the system. Now, what's interesting with trauma is it impacts, obviously, our system. It impacts our entire body system, not just the tissues, but also the organs, the fascia, the bone, the fluids, the digestion, the brain. And what we want to have happen when we have an unfavorable event. So I'm just going to call it that for a second, Garrett, an unfavorable event that throws us off and disorients us. Some of us, when this occurs, we bounce back. We're like, that was a real terrible thing. I need to have a moment. I need to talk to someone. I need to have a cry. I might need to have a scream. But then our system kind of comes back to homeostasis. The word here would be, it comes back to regulation. Some people have something happen to them and it throws them off for the rest of their lives. And that's a true thing. Like some people can have things that occur to them and they're never the same. And we know this if we think of those who go to war and battle on the war, the fields and are in combat, and they come back and, it's a terrible label, but this war veteran now has PTSD and it's going to be like that for the rest of their lives. So if we look at it from this context, trauma is anything that occurs to a person in the sense that it stays stuck. So what we would say is trauma is not in the event. It's not in the accident, the abuse, the screams that were given to us when we were young. It's in how it impacts us internally, specifically to the autonomic nervous system. So when we talk of trauma that's stored in the body, we must bring in that long-term, the autonomic nervous system, which governs all of our internal systems, as I know, digestion, immune response, hormones, reproductive health, all these things. But it also governs our fight, flight, and freeze. And that's where the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems come in, which are part of the autonomic nervous system. So to wrap back to your initial question, what is trauma? Trauma is something that impacts us long-term within our nervous system and throws the systems off. And it's not so much the event, because you can have two people that have the exact same event occur to them that is technically stressful. One walks away, they're fine. The other one has the same thing happen and they're a wreck forever. And to unpack and understand that, we have to actually go back to infancy. We have to go back to in utero, and we have to go back to what occurred to us in really the first 3 to 5 years of our lives as humans. Were we given a good start at learning regulation of our nervous system? So I would say, Garrett, that when I have these talks, 50% of the talk comes down to talking about this. What happens when we're young, something called co-regulation with an adult that teaches us how to be regulated. How that occurs will determine whether or not someone sticks the trauma to their system and they end up with these problems later in life: PTSD, complex PTSD, chronic illness, chronic pain. The reason I don't like the term big T and little t, and I'll just define it because I understand it, right? So big T people would be like, that's war, that's abuse, that's a big car accident, that's almost dying. Little t is verbal abuse, it's emotional abuse, it's where you're not physically harmed. But what we know, and the research has shown, is verbal abuse, emotional abuse, lack of attunement, lack of connection is just as traumatic, can be just as harmful on the physiology as getting into a car accident, as going to war. The system doesn't know the difference between physical, emotional, mental, verbal, even spiritual trauma, these sorts of things. And so what the system responds to is the stress, and whether that stress is a big stress or a little stress, to us, at least in my line of work, it depends on how the person reacts to that stressor, to that trauma. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I think that's super helpful to distinguish trauma as more related to the response, because you could have a seemingly minor, from someone's perspective, seemingly minor event and a major response based on whether they did or didn't learn to regulate themselves, as you said, or they could have a seemingly major event, but based on how effectively they can that person can regulate themselves, it doesn't create that same type of response. So there's of course a question in there that we'll put a pin in and then come back to about learning regulation. If it's possible to relearn that or learn it for the first time later in life if we missed that in the first 5 years. But before we get there, let's talk a little more about the effect of trauma. So how does these traumas, these experiences that stay stuck with us and continue to affect our nervous system, how does that impact us and lead to illness, pain, various symptoms? What's the connection there?
Ooh, it's a big connection. So I'm going to quote some research, which I don't often do, but I think it's important. So there was a study. Have you heard of the ACE study in your research and readings?
ACE study. I'm not sure by the name.
I'm
wonder.
Quizzing you.
Tell us what it is. And
yeah, it's short for the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study.
Oh yeah, I've at least heard of that. But yes,
yeah.
please.
So if I give a real quick Cliff's Notes version, basically it was a study that was found accidentally, quote unquote. So this happened actually in the United States in Southern California. There was a gentleman by the name of Vincent Felitti. He's a physician, he's still alive. And he was working for one of the big insurance companies for medicine. I think it was Kaiser Permanente in the States. And they were doing an intervention, not a scientific intervention, but it was like maybe like what you do with your work is you have a group of people who have a problem, you help them, they get support, they get counseling, movement, therapies. And so he was working with a group of individuals who were technically defined as obese, so incredibly overweight and unhealthy. And he wanted to see what would happen if we offered counseling, nutrition support, exercise support, community, all these things. And he found amazing results. People started dropping a lot of weight, hundreds of pounds of excess body fat, and they were getting healthier. And then what occurred, Garrett, is a lot of the people who were improving were going AWOL. They were like dropping out. And that confused them. Like, why would they stop this process when they were having such great results? One thing led to another. They tracked these people down. They started asking them questions. And what they found out was a lot of, if not all of the people dropping out had had severe early traumas. Well, let's say they called them adverse events. Parents who were mentally unwell, alcoholic parents, divorce, parents who were incarcerated, parents who belittled them and neglected and called them worthless, and tons of toxic shame. And basically, they grew up in really volatile, stressful environments. Most of the women had been sexually abused by their family members in some way, shape, or form. And what he saw and realized was, and this is not just shown in this, but in other work, that the excess weight was a form of protection. It was protecting them. So we'll put that aside. But what they then did is they were like, whoa, this is really interesting. This is in the 80s, like late 80s. And we knew that diet and exercise was important, but not the psycho-emotional, physical component. They started to ask these people more questions. And they looked at their health profiles, right? Chronic illness, cancers, heart disease, osteoarthritis, osteoporosis, all these long list. And the amount of early traumas they had correlated with the amount of illnesses they had, to the point where it was so statistically significant that they couldn't ignore it. And it was almost factual, even though this wasn't a double-blinded placebo-controlled study. It was longitudinal, retrospective, all these things. Sorry, it was retrospective data, but current time was a lot of these people who have multiple chronic illnesses, chronic pains, we would call these things fibromyalgia, autoimmune, chronic illness, cancers, etc. That the amount of illness was related to how many what we call ACE scores they had. So how many adverse childhood experiences they had. This little stumbling onto that research was like, what's going on here? Why are these people that had so much adversity, why are they so sick? And so this is a long way of coming back to your question, how does trauma affect the body? When we are under a constant state of threat, even if you're in a household, Garrett, where there's tons of food in the fridge, roofs over the head, you're going to soccer practice, you're going to school, there's no worry of, say, finance, because we always attribute this to low income, no money. This was like what we would call middle class. This wasn't low income, these individuals, because they were within a health initiative, right? Even if you're in an environment where mom and dad, they just kind of don't like each other. They don't know how to communicate. They don't know how to show emotion. They don't know how to attune to you as an infant, as a toddler, as a child. That is stressful, as is, of course, real abuse and shouting and hitting and all this stuff that is just sadly so common. What occurs in that little person's system is they start to not only go into a stress response, they go into what's called a shutdown response. So when you're little, when you're 3, or even when you're a baby, you can't fight, right? You can't flee. You're essentially stuck there in this situation. And so what the physiology does, and this is where the parasympathetic nervous system comes in. The parasympathetic nervous system has a portion of it that says, Mayday, Mayday, we can't fight, we can't flee. We better go into this freeze response and get really quiet and really shut down. Our breath is going to go low. We're going to slow down everything. All our processes are going to go into kind of like hibernation mode.
So that's a great description for everyone, just to underline this, great description of the polyvagal theory.
Yes.
Something else that we talk about a little bit in other circumstances, but please continue.
Yeah, this is Polyvagal Theory 101. So essentially, you're little, you can't say, hey, mom, you're not paying attention to me. You can't say that when you're a 6-month-old, right? When you're crying and no one's there, which was such common practice for so many babies. Just leave them to cry. That will help them regulate. No, it won't. They're going to go into shock, right? It's completely ludicrous that we still teach parents this, right? Sleep training, let them cry. It's abusive, because what happens is that infant has to shut down. And so when they shut down, they stop attuning to their own needs. They stop listening to their body. They essentially anesthetize their sensations, their needs, their feelings, so they become the good baby. And I can guarantee you, if you talk to people who have chronic illness, certain types of autoimmune, and they know a bit about their history, I'm going to say 85% of those people, the parents will say, you were such a good baby. You never cried. You never fussed. You were the perfect little specimen of a human. But that's not what babies are supposed to do. It's like, think about a little puppy or a kitten. They're rambunctious. They're always wanting to play, right? That's how they learn. That's how they engage. And so what happens, to go back to how does this stuff impact us? If we think about that autonomic nervous system, the fight, flight, and then the freeze, that autonomic nervous system also governs the digestion. It governs the cardiovascular, cardiorespiratory, the neurology. It governs our chemistry. It governs the signals up to the brain from the gut to tell us this is safe, this isn't safe, this is neuroception, something that Stephen Porges also coined. Our fascia, our bone, our muscle, it becomes hardened, it becomes armored. Or, Garrett, the flip side, some people flip into the opposite, no tone. They become over flexible. They become, it's like they kind of, it's going to sound terrible, but they look like Gumby, right? They have no life in them. And it's because their system has collapsed so much that they can basically be a doormat that people could stomp on. I know this is really explicit, but that's what occurs. People will say, I just keep getting into these terrible abusive relationships, and it's like there's no boundary, there's no fight energy, there's no ability to say no, to have that strong, healthy aggression. So what we see is this situation in a nervous system where it has been basically in survival mode for many of us since we were in utero. If mom was in a situation that wasn't good, and we know this from mothers who were pregnant during, say, 9/11, during the Holocaust, those kiddos have more stress in their system, more cortisol, they're more panicked, they're more anxious. So it goes back as far as that, but even how mom was raised. So this is that whole element of transgenerational trauma, how we keep these things unless we heal them. So, to make it simple, when we have been under stress, under duress, and we've had to suppress our fight and our flight And for the most part, Garrett, if someone is struggling with chronic pain, fibromyalgia, autoimmune, certain cancers, they are living in some form of this shutdown of the deep parasympathetic system. And I liken it to a swamp. There's no oxygen, there's no clean water recycling the tissues. So waste products get stuck. The system can't keep up the immune system in a healthy way. So they're always getting sick. They're immunocompromised. They can't heal wounds as fast. The gut lining doesn't heal. This is where we then get gut problems and IBS. And so this is why this ACE study showed this whole slew of chronic health problems when there was early adversity. And so what's occurring with these kiddos is they become adults, and youth is on our side for a little bit of time. There is a little bit more immune capacity. But what we're also seeing is we're seeing kids who are getting sicker younger. We're seeing people in their 20s with chronic illness when normally we wouldn't see this into the 60s, 40s, 50s. So I just kind of gave you a lot of information, but in a generality, early stress, early survival responses, the fight, flight, freeze that's always on. Over time, the system just wears out, it wears down. And this is where we get these chronic illnesses. And then, of course, what we would consider mental illness is still rooted in this stuff. It's just representing in the mind, but it's the physiology that's driving that illness.
Yes, that makes a ton of sense. Thank you, Irene, for that description. One of the things that we talk about in some of our certification courses is this, the biopsychosocial model of pain, and this concept of the threat neuromatrix, or the threat bucket, metaphorically, where whatever the stressor is, it goes into this bucket, and once it reaches a certain level, the output is going to be pain, even if the thing that put you over the edge wasn't a physical insult, but it was, the threat of missing a deadline or losing a job or fighting with one's spouse or whatever, whatever it might be. And so I think that speaks to, if some of these, adverse childhood experiences happen to somebody, their bucket might be smaller, or they have stuff in their bucket already, so they have less capacity to handle more things and are more apt to experience pain. So certainly, I think we've talked in our curriculum and in this podcast how that's related to chronic pain, but let's also look at some things that might not at first glance seem to be related. Like we've spoke a little bit before about an example of frozen shoulder, which that seems like there's more of a structural component, and it's not necessarily as obviously an autonomic link like that. So can you help us make that connection and kind of see how this type of thinking can extrapolate even to issues like that?
Totally. So this is, I got schooled early on this when I was learning somatic experiencing. I had a client who came to me, and when I learned the trauma work, I was already a hands-on practitioner through fitness and Feldenkrais. So I had a practice where people were coming to me with body pain. So back pain, knee injuries, neck, and then things like frozen shoulder. And I wrote a long case study about this individual, so I'm allowed to speak about it. I call her Grace. It's the story of Grace. It's on my site. A person can find that if they want. But she came to me because she had literally been to every single therapeutic modality where I lived at the time. And there were good people in this. This was a ski town in British Columbia. So great high-end physios, acupuncture, chiro, massage. She had done it all. And I got all these cases. They're like, go to Irene. Okay. And, she walked in, and all I remember seeing was she looked like a bird whose wings had been broken. And if you've ever come across an animal where they have a dysfunction, they are depressed. They know they can't survive if they had to. And so I started working with her from a more of a Feldenkraisian lens, like, okay, well, let's see your function. Let's see your movement. How is your spine working, your pelvis, all that. And I work on a low level table, Feldenkrais table. And she sat on the table and then she went to lie down. And as soon as she lied down, she held her breath. I was like, that's interesting. So I said, do you know that you just held your breath when you went to lay down? And her big, no, I didn't. And I'm like, okay, well, let's try this. Like, come back to sit, because I don't want her to lay down in fear. So we worked together for probably 2.5 years. When she came to me, both her shoulders were frozen. She couldn't like lift them. Like women, to do things like their hair and their bras, like you need to be able to move your hands. I mean, all people do, but it really destroys your function. And she thought that the frozen shoulder was because of a ski accident. So she was skiing, she fell, she broke her ribs. And so when you break your ribs, it's painful. You can't breathe deep and you can't really move your arms, because the clavicle then goes to the sternum and all those things. And so she had been in a sling for weeks to try to recover these ribs. And I'm like, there's something more here. So as we started to work together, it was very clear that doing Feldenkrais with her wasn't going to work, because the structure was so frozen, so clamped down. So we started talking. We started doing more gentle somatic experiencing stuff. I was just starting to learn this stuff at this time. So my knowledge was small, I should say. But one thing led to another. And this is an intense story, but she was sexually abused as a child throughout her entire childhood by family friends. And it was horrific, to the point where she had to watch her brother be abused as well. Like terrible, terrible. And so one day, and I laugh because we had fun together. Like she wasn't a victim. She's like, yeah, this is what happened. It sucks. And I have a great job. I have a great husband. Like she did really well considering what her early life was like. And so one day, this was like a year into our work, because we were really working on her just being able to breathe, being able to be in her body, feel her body. She was completely disconnected from her body. And she's lying down, I can't really show this, but like she's in a coffin, like arms smushed to her side, like waiting for something. And I looked at her and I said, when you were being abused, did you ever get tied down? And she looked at me, well, of course I did. Like I should have known that, right? And what had occurred is, and this is intense, she was tied to beds and tied up to trees outside. It's intense, I know. This is what happens, right? We need to know these things when we're working with people. Because if I hadn't have thought to ask her that, we wouldn't have had the next breakthrough. So I was like, okay. And we had already developed a good rapport. She trusted me, And so I said, I'm going to put some pressure against your arms. I'm going to sit to the side of you. And what I want you to do is I want you to sense my hand, but also connect to that image from when you were little. But we're here, right? It's me, but we're here and this day. But I want you to feel what it would be like to press my arm away, to essentially break free from these ropes, these things that were holding you down. Okay, like she was so fully game for it. And I really got her to feel and sense the aggression and the anger. And she did it. And Garrett, no word of a lie, her arms freed up. Now, it took us up to a year to get to that. Because like you said, her capacity, her bucket was so full and there was no capacity. So we had to inch our way. We titrated, that's the word we would use. And I actually, this happened in like 2008, 7, this story, I still get shivers when I talk about it, because if nobody had ever gone that deep into her history, she would probably still be going to people to try to manipulate. She might have even, like, they'll do surgery where they put you under. And it's like, it isn't it's in the structure, and the structure will get damaged, of course, if you don't mobilize and move. And it's not even just in the brain. What was in inside of her was what's called this is important, a stored traumatic procedural memory. So when something happens to us, the best example is, let's say I'm on a soccer pitch and a ball comes to my face and I see it. If I'm not going to headbutt it, I'm going to protect my face and eyes with a quick movement of my hand, right? Another example, you're chopping onions at your kitchen counter, you drop the knife. What do? You jump back so that you don't hit yourself with the knife. These are automatic procedure memories. So the brain, the nervous system, and the muscles will write a script within microseconds, probably nanoseconds. I don't even know the seconds, but quick, to say, pull the leg away, protect the head. You fall, you put your hands out. All these things happen really quickly. That is the brain protecting you. That is the nervous system protecting you, because it's not just the brain, it's all of it. So when you have an abuse situation like this, where you're little, you can't fight, but you want to. You want to run, you want to fight, you want to kick that person. You probably want to murder them because they're hurting you, but you can't. These procedures get stored in your entire physiology, not just in the shoulder, but in the breath, in the gut bracing, in the way we see things in people. After time, when people are abused, and you hear people say this, they will say, I was out of my body watching myself from above. That is how we dissociate to handle these things. So this story with this frozen shoulder situation is an example of how early stuff can create this incident. So basically, her shoulders were fine until she had that ski accident. So that ski accident, and mimicking being held down and not breathing deeply, mirrored what occurred when she was young, repeatedly and repeatedly. And so the system froze. Literally, the shoulders froze into that position. So that is one big example of how frozen shoulder often is not a result of just an impact. It is overcoupled often with these old memories. Another one, I'm just going to say it because a lot of people are like, well, I have frozen shoulder, but I was never abused. True. I've seen a lot of people who have had surgical traumas. So if you're little and you're held down, if you're held down because something's happening to you and you don't like it and you can't break your arms free, right? How many kids are held down when they have things happen to them? And often we don't know how to do aftercare with those kids to let them get their fight response out. And it's so important.
If you're ready to supercharge your practice, listen to this. Garrett and Team NeuFit have just released a new online course entitled Introduction to the NeuFit Method. In this detailed 8-hour course, you'll gain mastery of the fundamental techniques in our practice, including muscle testing and activations, nerve glides, and joint articulations. You'll also get introduced to our patented direct current stimulation device, the NeuBe, an incredible machine that's empowered professionals just like you to help their patients heal, adapt, and grow faster than they ever thought possible. To learn more, go to www.neu.fit/learn. And now back to the show.
Yes, well, that's great. I think there's two threads here when we talk about trauma that are coming out here. One, of course, is the autonomic nervous system and how that can affect. That's stress hormones and all the negative effects of chronically elevated stress hormones on digestion, on waste elimination, fertility, on psychology and affect, mood and behavior. And then also these physical patterns that can be associated, and like the example of frozen shoulder. But I think for the people listening to this, if we're talking about physical therapy, chiropractic, we could be the people that Grace would have come to see, and we might try more mechanical oriented treatments with her, and they may not have helped. And so this shows an avenue for some, for all of us, the more difficult cases, there might be some trauma here. And it's something that I think that, we'll learn more and more about how to use the NeuBe, for example, in cases like this. But, there's times where it might be, if anyone gets a whiff that some of this might be going on, maybe it's something that's you want to refer out to someone who's more better equipped to handle this. But it's something to be aware of, and can certainly explain why someone may not be responding as we might expect.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's important.
And I also want to say, I mean, I'm someone who has used a lot of physical therapy, a lot of massage, osteo, cranio. I have so much history of shock traumas and injuries and accidents that is too long to go through. So sometimes you need to have a team, right, that is collaborating for this person. And so there's no shame. It's just like, I can't do internal surgery the way a doctor can, I'm not going to try to do that because that's their job. But then I might be the person that helps prepare that person go into surgery so they're less stressed. Because when you go into, say, surgery with more awareness, you come out better. Your healing time is better. And so there is something important for those listening to this who are the physical therapists, the exercise trainers, the massage therapists. When you understand even just the theory of this, you are able to better attune to and open up the door for your clients. Because if you don't, and I've seen a lot of people be dismissed, like, oh no, this is no way that this injury could be an emotional thing. Of course it can. Everything is connected. And so I think that's a part that I believe is starting to shift, and that's why we're having this conversation, right? It's so important to have a multifaceted approach, because then you might need to go back to the physical work to recondition that bone that has not moved and the tendons that have weakened due to poor use for how many years, right? So it's all about when is the right time for what.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
A great way to frame it up. I do want to tie this back to the use of the newbie and get some of your thoughts there that can be helpful to people in NeuFit Nation, in our community.
Sure.
And before we do that, also one question, because you touched on it a little bit, but I think it's worth spending a few minutes specifically on how one heals from trauma, because you talked about with Grace, for example, and working through her issues with frozen shoulder, but there's a couple parts to this. Like, for example, when helping someone recover from trauma, or going back, we learned trauma is the response. So helping someone change the response, get out of these habitual patterns of autonomic response and movement, and all sorts of things. So helping someone work through this. How do you do that? And is it necessary to talk about or even think about or in some way relive the original trauma? And how, as you mentioned, it comes back to whether we learn to regulate ourselves or not, at or before the age of 5. So how can we learn to re-regulate ourselves, and to what degree is it necessary to revisit the traumatic event?
So it depends on what occurred or what didn't occur. So for someone, well, how do I say this? I haven't met anybody yet in the Western world who hasn't been impacted by something, whether it's trauma, misattunement from their parents, a school system that did not allow them what they needed to learn. I don't want to scare anyone, but we're sort of, a lot of us are screwed in how we were brought up. And it's okay, right? It can be shifted. You asked a little while ago, is it possible to heal this stuff when you're an adult? And the answer is 100% yes. Even if you had neglect, abuse, lack of attunement. If someone is listening to this or is able to read and nod their head, when I say nod your head with me and all these things, then a person can heal this stuff. The only situation where I would say a person couldn't is if someone was literally neglected to the point where they can't speak, right? And this happens, kids that are put in cages and are never found, and they are needing to be cared for as children for the rest of their lives, right? So that's an extreme case, because I don't want to say everybody can do this, but if you're here listening, you can probably do this. So no, you don't have to relive the traumas. In many ways, that's impossible, because that would mean time travel. which is up for debate, whether or not that can occur. But what we can do is work in the present moment with the memories, the sensations, the qualities that you remember from that time, but in current time. The other thing that's important to know, Garrett.
Just to clarify on that. So you think that there, in terms of this learning to re-regulate and dealing with the lingering trauma, it is necessary to at least re-experience some element, some of the sensations or something from the past event?
100%.
Okay.
Now, it depends on when this occurred. So we would classify pre-verbal and early developmental trauma under the age of 3. I like to say under the age of 5, but it depends on how advanced that human soul is. Sometimes it could be older, but people say under the age of 3 in utero, that's pre-verbal, early developmental trauma. There's no formed memories. So you can't say, yeah, I remember laying there as a 2-month-old and seeing my parents fight, right? But what you do remember is the cellular essence, the feeling that something is not right, but it's a sensation. It's not even necessarily an emotion. So for those people who had that kind of trauma, it's less about trying to find the memory and the event, and it's more about building up safety and capacity. Now, a lot of those individuals don't have connection to their body. It's back to the story I talked about where you start to shut down if nobody's there to pick you up. So the capacity is very small. The connection to the self is very small. And the connection to the environment is limited. Because when you're in that stressful situation, you start to dissociate, disconnect from the world, and you don't even know it's there. So one of the steps for those that have that kind of trauma, and you're, say, an adult, and you know that this is probably why you have these chronic problems, this is where talk therapy doesn't work. This is where you have to work with the somatic body. And this is where the whole buzzword of working somatically comes in that it isn't just about working with the physical body, the muscles and the bones and the movement. That's important. But we have to work with the stress organs that were under fire, under attack because of the outside threat. So it's very different than kind of classic psychoanalysis where you're talking about your problems and you're just kind of like blenderizing them over and over again, but they're not actually producing anything. It's working with this stress organ level, the way you would hold a baby, Garrett, when they're scared, right? You aren't going to talk and try to reason to a baby if they've had a fright. You hold them, you soothe them gently with your voice, with your hand. You give them this sense that they're okay. That's what you're okay. It's okay. Shh. This, softening, touch, connection. That's that co-regulation. So for an adult, what I've discovered in my work is how to teach an adult how to find that again with themselves through, this is the online work I do. If you were to see me in person, we would do that in person with touch work, with attunement, connection. That's what I was doing before I put everything online. So that's one way that you start to work with this. Then there's people that do remember. Yeah, I had that accident, had this happen. That also requires, for many in this day and age, still that stress organ work. But it also might mean working with specific details of those events. And that's more classic somatic experiencing work. The work of Peter Levine is, okay, you had this car accident. Okay, well, we're going to work with slices of time before, after, and during the event to dip into the held of not just emotions, but the shock, the bracing patterns, the survival stress, concussion. I've had really good success with concussion. One of the reasons why concussion is so slow to heal, from what I've seen, is the survival stress is never dealt with. And so if the shock is still sitting in the autonomic nervous system, that impact is still there. All the great brain retraining in the world won't get in deep enough because the system still thinks it's in the accident. So, and we see this when you meet someone who's had an accident, they have like that deer in the headlight look, right? That's just the sign that they are still stuck in shock. They're stuck in freeze. So to heal this stuff is not a one sheet with bullet points. There's lots of padding, lots of nuance. And the best way I can liken it to, Garrett, is when you have a newborn baby, you can't just hold them once a week. When you have a newborn baby, it's this constant connection, listening, attuning, teaching, resting, playing, feeding. And that's actually what I teach my students is how can you reattune to yourself as an organism, and how can you start listening to your impulses, listening to your physiology. Most people have no clue that they have a nervous system. They just know they're stressed out, or they know they have no energy, or they know they have tons of resistance, or they're in pain. And so it's like, okay, we have to go back to like human body 101 and be like, yeah, you've got this thing that has protected you for 50 years. And this is why. And this is why when you go outside, you keep getting into accidents. You don't realize there's a world around you. So one of the things we teach is reorienting and getting back into the present moment. And a lot of therapies neglect to get a person in the present moment, in the here and now. I taught fitness for years. I can guarantee you most of the people at my classes weren't there. Their bodies were there, but they were thinking about, everything else. And when that occurs, you can still get a good workout in, but you're not actually embodying that, which is why people would have to come back over and over again because they weren't learning anything. They were getting fit, but they weren't integrating it, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a very kind of all over the place way and I'm saying this for good reason, is there's no one, this is what you do. But the essence is you're trying to reteach the system how to have more capacity, how to connect internally, how to connect on the outside, and restore regulation. And the funny thing is that when you restore this stuff, you have to work less at getting the traumas out. They just start to come out naturally because the system is healthier. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like it's hard to detox from something if your organs are sluggish and tired, right? Like you need to sometimes build up the robustness of the body so that things can naturally come out. And it's the same way with this.
I think that's a great kind of loop back to the first thing that you said in defining trauma. And let me see if you think this is a fair statement to say that if trauma is not just about the original event, but our response to it, if you can train someone to better handle stress, increase their capacity or resilience or whatever word you might like to use, you can actually perhaps even indirectly have some effect on their trauma state and help them move through that in some way.
100%. And what I'll add to that is when you reteach a person how to have that, we can call it wholeness with the present moment. What also occurs is they stop adding things to the system. So what I often say to folks is don't worry so much about what occurred to you yesterday or 30 years ago. If there's an event that occurs today, like my classic example, if you stub your toe on the coffee table today, don't just keep walking. Like sit down, feel the pain, feel the frustration. If you want to cry, have a cry, and then wait until the pain has completely gone away. Most people do that, and what do? They keep going. They don't even know that they did it. They're like, "Ow, no, that's a nuisance. I got to keep going." And so we've trained ourselves to not take the time to process things. And so by doing that, forward from this moment, you're not going to put as much stress, as much survival physiology into the system.
Mm-hmm.
Just by that alone, you build capacity. And so what occurs is when you have a fleeting memory that comes in that you had forgotten about, because you've done, you could say, the nervous system hygiene to take care of yourself in the present moment, when that old memory floods in, or when you get that phone call from someone that you don't really want to talk to, you're better able to deal with the stress physiology in the moment because you've practiced dealing with the stress physiology in everyday little events.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense?
Yeah. So learning to regulate ourselves through daily stressors, and then doing things like putting the newbie aside for a moment, but doing things like perhaps meditation or cold exposure, things that help us regulate our autonomic nervous system, can help us with trauma. But you still, in order to really get all the way through it to whatever degree that that's possible to kind of maximize it, it still is necessary to also revisit some of the experiences around that as well. So this stuff we can do is all helpful, and it gets us to the place where we can do that more effectively. And then that work is still necessary to get as complete of a healing as one is capable of getting.
Yeah. And I would say I'm all for cold exposure meditation, but not for this. Mm-hmm. So if someone can't even notice when they have to go to the bathroom and they hold it, mm-hmm. I mean, it's really simple, or even their hunger cues, cold exposure and meditation is too advanced for a system that is that disconnected. Because what occurs is that you put someone in that extreme environment and their system will micromanage the discomfort, mm-hmm. and they'll breathe it through. And they'll calm themselves with the breath. And the trouble with that is that, again, those therapies are great for very specific therapeutic reasons, but not for healing the nervous system. I actually have been talking a lot recently and in the past about why meditation is the last thing we should be teaching children, for example. Because if a child is healthy, they naturally are in the moment. They don't need to meditate. And so some of these practices that we've thought of to be good for healing the nervous system are actually diverting the person away from the discomfort of what they actually have to feel, that is really essential. So it's all about timing. I like to say we need to have proper neuroplastic healing sequencing. Just like if a baby is crying and crying, you don't say to it, I need you to take 10 deep breaths.
Right.
It won't work. It won't work. It won't make sense. And so a lot of us, our systems are that immature, but we've been taught, just do these things, do these strategies. But what they're doing, Garrett, is they're managing the discomfort, which might help. Like I always say to someone, if going into a little bit of bypass, somatic bypass, or a bit of breath work will help you from not hitting your kids, then do it. But then we have to work with that urge that is the desire to say, hit your kids. Where is that coming from? It's usually from something that occurred to you when you were young, because you probably got hit and you couldn't hit back, So I just want to say that because it's important for people to know that a lot of the biohacking techniques, which I know very well, have a time and a place, but not for regulating the nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think that's a whole other conversation around some of the techniques and different things that mm-hmm. that we can do. That we just even talked a little bit about before hitting record. Some different avenues that we've seen whereby technology like the newbie can help people. But there's a whole other conversation there. Let's just do one quick question to kind of hear some of your thoughts, and perhaps it'll set the stage for a part 2 down the road.
Definitely.
So one of the things that we do that I think would probably be helpful here is what we call our master reset. It's sort of our version of a vagus nerve stimulation, helps people shift into a more parasympathetic dominant state. We've seen data that shows significant increases in heart rate variability, even greater, far greater than just lying down and doing diaphragmatic breathing. So something
Yep.
like that, would you agree or disagree is generally valuable? Or well, be curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, well, it depends on the context,
Mhm.
right? Because I get these questions a lot. I'll get asked about EMDR, EFT, vagus stimulation. So it depends on the context. And is that person integrating that change into daily life? And that's really the main question. So I can't answer that other than to say, is it, I'm using my hand, is it rippling into the other elements? So is their gut improving? Is their emotional response improving? Heart rate variability is a great biomarker, but are they able to go outside and connect with the world? Are they able to do tasks that previously caused them to go frozen in fear, right? And so it is this element of great therapeutic, use it, and then how can that person get to a point where that change can be rippled and integrated into other things. There's a great thing that Peter Levine has brought to the table that a lot of people use, and it's a sound. It's a toning sound that is from Eastern traditions that is a beautiful way to stimulate and perk up the vagus nerve. It's a sound that is like a loud foghorn sound, kind of like the yoga om, but it's a woo sound. And he writes about this in all of his books. And having worked with Peter and seen him do sessions many, many, many times, he will often use this sound. It's sort of like a biohack. But sometimes he won't. Sometimes he won't even touch it because he can see that the person's capacity is so small that it would frighten their system and be too much to have that input. So I think it's case dependent, Garrett, and it depends on knowing who you're with. So that's my way of describing that. It's just like acupuncture. A lot of people are like, yeah, I did acupuncture back in the day and it really didn't do anything. But now that I have more ability to feel my insides and feel the energy pathways, I get some acupuncture and whew, it's amazing. And it's because that person, this is my story. I had acupuncture when I was in my 20s. I'm like, this isn't doing anything. But it's because I was frozen. I was functionally frozen. I couldn't sense these energetic lines. So if we use anything with someone, we want them to be engaged with what they're feeling and what they're sensing, so that it isn't just a thing that's being strapped onto them. That's how I would describe that. I hope that is clear.
Yeah, for sure. So there can certainly potential for value for help with healing, but only to the extent that it's integrated, that it's part of the process that's guiding towards a direction of trauma-informed healing, we'll say.
Yeah, at the end of the day, we want to all be retired in 30 years, right? In other words, that's my joke of saying we don't want people to have to keep coming back to us to get these therapeutics. We want them to be able to get regulated so that they're not needing this anymore. And that's the portion. If I think back to the story of Grace, the frozen shoulder lady, like I said, she'd still be in that ringer if she hadn't have gotten this one piece that was super important. And so that's the part, is how can this be multidisciplinary and be like, this isn't the only thing. How can you learn how to regulate your vagus nerve eventually without anything? And that's the part that I'm interested in. And then sometimes, just like, I've had so many knee surgeries, I can't put them on my hands to count. Like sometimes I needed to have some electrical stim to get that vastus medialis perked up, right? But then that has to get perked up by proper walking mechanics again. So it's I sort of parallel it in the same way. How can it help therapeutically? And then how can you teach the person to spark up that vagus nerve through social engagement, which is the best way to spark it up, through breathing that isn't breath work, but is just easy breathing because the system isn't in a trauma response anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I would frame that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then the other kind of part B to this same question, in terms of, you know, bringing it back to some of the things that our audience that we're doing with the newbie and some of our techniques.
Yeah.
I imagine the answer to this question will have some similarities to what you just said about that master reset, about that parasympathetic activation. But another technique for, you know, probably the one for which we're best known is this mapping process, where we can scan around on the body, you know, like we were talking about earlier, and find these areas exactly where the nervous system is imposing these patterns of guarding, protection, inhibition on the body in response to you know, the trauma of injury and or the hypersensitivity, C fiber activation that could lead to chronic pain. And going through this, you know, I've had experiences where we'll find these, you know, what we call hotspots, or find these areas on people, and it will remind them, they'll come up and say, oh my gosh, I remember when I got hit there, I fell there. So there's some element of, you know, from time to time where it seems like it's obviously bringing up some sort of traumatic memory. And it seems like there's an avenue by which this process could help people work through trauma, because those neurological patterns are stored somewhere in the body. And if we can find them, it seems like there's value there. But I'd be curious to hear your, at least at this time, just preliminary thoughts on where something like that might fit in to your framework for how you look at treating these sorts of challenges.
Well, if I had, you know, that device, and I had someone whom already has a bit of capacity to be able to remember that thing, that accident, then we could be like, okay, this sparks up that declarative memory, that memory of, oh yeah, that's when the baseball bat hit my elbow, you know, and there's still stuff stored in there. And then at that point, it would be key to then, how do I describe this? To have them know how to go internal and process the memory, the sensation, because sensation is what breeds emotion, the sensation, but also the movements, the actions, the behaviors that might need to come out of the body to release that hotspot, so to speak. So that's key. And then the other thing is, a lot of somatic areas are completely deadened because of so much shock and trauma, that those areas are literally somatically dissociated. So my curiosity would be, could that device pick up on stored trauma where that area has been shut down for decades, let's say? And of course, I don't know the answer to that, but that would be an interesting thing. How you would do that, I'm not sure, because the person wouldn't know. But it's like, would it come across something and be like, there's something here because of the tissue quality and just the energetic deadness of the area? And then could you do some work, hands-on or self-touch, that would bring a person to feel that area and then tune into all their organ systems, which can sometimes trap these traumas? So it's kind of like a field trip within the system, right? So that'd be my 2 cents on how would I work with something like that.
Yes. Well, I think that sets the stage for some opportunities that we have to use this to help more in that domain. And perhaps when I'm in Vancouver or you're in Austin, we can find a little time to experiment with this. But until then, thank you very much, Irene,
you're welcome,
for coming on and sharing your experience and your perspective. I think this is a fascinating area, exciting opportunity for those of us in NeuFit Nation, especially those of us who haven't had as much experience or learned as much about trauma, you know, to really get a good introduction, just kind of get the lay of the land and understand how we may be able to help, where we may need to refer out, but might be able to identify opportunities to help here, things that we may wish to learn more about in the future. You know, there's a lot here. So for people that want to learn more about what you're up to, see some of your work and your courses and different things that you're offering, I know you're on Instagram, but let us know what are the best ways to look you up and stay in touch.
Really my website, just my name, irenelyon.com. And then in addition to Instagram, I would say YouTube is probably the most popular channel. Just there's a lot there, so don't be overwhelmed. But there's close to 500 videos, just all the topics. There's lectures, there's interviews, and then there's just me speaking to camera teaching. So they've been deemed binge worthy. So that's something to check out. And then, my courses, I've got a couple. One is a self-study, one is a 12-week curriculum. And we've had like you said at the beginning, folks from all over the world, I think 90 countries so far go through them. And really people who are practitioners too. Like a lot of our students are therapists, are massage therapists, physical trainers, teachers. School teachers learn so much in how they can help their students with this. So it's applicable to everyone because we all have a nervous system and we're all living in this crazy world that has conditioned us to not express ourselves to a certain degree. And we have to find that balance between humanness, but also the biological side of us that needs to express those animal instincts that are often suppressed in humans. So yeah. All that to say, all the stuff is on my site.
Fabulous. So I think that's an excellent way to close our conversation today. Thank you so much, Irene, for coming on the show here and sharing your wisdom and experience and perspective. And I'm sure that everyone listening learned something new, if not many somethings new.
I hope so.
We appreciate you. And I think there might be enough here for a part 2 at some point in the future. So we'll just plant that seed.
Yes. Thanks, Garrett. Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Thank you, Irene. And thanks everyone for tuning into this episode of the NeuFit Undercurrent podcast. Thank you so much for listening to the Undercurrent podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review and be sure to subscribe to stay up to date as we release future episodes.